How are you doing? Good, good. I
Here
actually
I am.
can't
I'm good.
join tonight.
How are you?
Good. I actually can't join tonight. I have family in town, but I'm making sure everything's all set up.
Oh, okay, thanks.
So I'm just gonna mute and turn my camera off, and Rabbi Segal should be joining soon. I'll check in on
Okay,
you in a
great.
bit.
Have fun with family.
I know it's against the rules, but I want to say hi anyway. Hi, everybody.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, Felix.
Hello, shalom.
Hi,
Shalom.
everybody. So I'm trying to make sure that the Zoom is actually working
Zooming.
and the way it's supposed to.
You were
y'all-
zooming and you're recording, Rabbi.
oh, I am? Okay, so
Yes, you're all
so
set.
I can bail off of the Zoom on my iPad. Wonderful.
Well, you need to be zoomed in somewhere.
Well,
We only
I think on the computer that's here, I think is the question.
Let me see. iPad. Something says iPad.
I think you should.
Yeah.
I see you. I
We
hear
see you
and I
straight
see you.
on. I think you did. Is it showing up on the TV?
Yeah, and it says 11 participants.
Hello, good, how are you?
Good.
So I think I may need to sign out of the Zoom that's on the computer and then sign back in this.
However, we see
info.
you right now is working. So,
That's on my iPad, but I need my iPad.
got
my
it.
notes on it.
Got it. Yes.
I'm gonna sign out of the computer and then sign back or join the meet. Have the computer join the meeting through this meeting ID.
Okay,
I
thank
will
Alright.
say a
you.
prayer
See you
for
in a
you.
minute.
Make sure that works. Please God, make this work.
So how are you? We're good. We had 8 shows this week. Good. Yeah.
Gonna see Paul Eckhart.
No.
No.
That's Kristen Chuck.
Newberg.
Yeah,
No.
Rabbi Scott, I think we see you.
And it was fun.
I just like the music.
Yeah.
So what are you gonna sing?
But we see the ceiling.
And something.
Yeah, I kept that Zoom on while I sign into this other Zoom or on this other computer.
The Eagles.
Yeah.
Yeah, so.
You wanna see something, you'll find it. At least there'll be a smile on your face.
Are you really gonna do it?
I'm really
Yeah.
gonna send it in and get, yeah, I got all the seeds.
Recording in progress.
Success. Even more success. Except now you're muted.
What?
Okay.
Yes.
I wasn't in a pharmacy filling.
I can hear you now. Good to go. I'm gonna mute myself.
You guys see me
Did it with you. Probably.
or no?
Maybe.
Yeah. Okay. There we go. Okay, cool. Wonderful.
So who are you talking
Yeah, I
to?
remember.
Well, I was talking to Wendy.
Oh, to Wendy,
Um,
okay.
Looking good. Thank you, Scott.
And you're fantastic.
All good.
You're here. Well, fun.
Huh? Oh, just popped in to say hello.
Hi,
And,
Kenner.
Yeah, just enthusiastic about.
I got the password. You want the password and everything?
I've got it here too.
All right, I'm going back. Let me know when you're done.
Who's for all?
Oh, enjoy. Oh, what did I do?
Okay.
Rabbi, you don't mind that we sit here far away.
No, not at all. As a dedicated sitting in the back of the room person, I feel
Spill beans?
yes, very much so.
Yeah.
Yeah, my spookies usually come out as tapping. Also from
So much
playing
better.
drums for so long, and it tends to drive everyone around me absolutely crazy.
Well, my pacing can get a little
so-
irritating, but hey.
Yeah, my classmates in rabbinical school used to just get ever so annoyed with my. Because half the time I didn't even realize I was doing it. I'll just be like.
And nobody
listening
gave you
and-
the elbow?
Yeah, well, and especially once Emily and I started dating, she became kind of the designated get him to stop person.
The music's going on in your head too, right?
Always.
Okay, all right, well,
There's
then it's
a
okay, yeah.
constant stream of music and rhythms. Okay. So when last we met, if I remember correctly, we kind of ended with the 6-Day War. And so, today we're gonna start right after that and hopefully get, make some good progress here. We will likely need an additional session to get through everything up to today, which, we'll kind of figure out the logistics of that
Will there be an extra charge?
sometime. Just for, so, after the 6 Day War, one of the things that I did not mention last time, but it's an important thing to make note of, is that following the end of it, we get known as the UN Resolution 242. And the reason that's so important is because that was one of the kind of first international statements since the partition plan in 47 to kind of speak to the reality of a two-state solution. It did so in very vague terms. I also learned that the way it was interpreted in French there were some important differences from the way it was interpreted in English. And so it's one of these things where like one word can make a difference. In this case, it was a difference between territories versus the territories. And so different sides, depending on which version they chose to pay attention to, kind of made came to different understandings of what that meant. But UN Resolution 242 has kind of been part of the conversation ever since. It also spoke to the issue of Palestinian refugees, which will continue to be has been an issue really since 48, but especially since 67. So following 67, Israel to a large extent was riding high. They were kind of filled with confidence after their success in that war. They had gained a massive amount of territory. I mean, let's keep in mind that we have the West Bank, we have, including Jerusalem, we have the Gaza Strip, we have the Golan Heights, we have the entirety of the Sinai Peninsula. I mean, it was a massive, massive territorial growth, almost in an instant, it felt like. And so there was a lot of confidence within Israel, which coincided, fairly or not, with an increased amount of kind of disdain for the Arab world, and a kind of growing belief that basically that Israel was so far superior that they really didn't have anything to worry about. So after the war, for basically the next 6 years, one of the things that happens, there's a couple important things that happens. One is we start to see the growth of the settler movement, and now that these territories were kind of under Israel's control, particularly the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, because they had a lot of kind of biblical and religious meaning, they became very popular places for particularly religious Jews to want to settle. Also, apparently, it was very inexpensive for people to live there, so you could kind of build a better life, a more comfortable place to live, and all that kind of stuff. But on the flip side, within the settler movement, you have kind of a growing kind of militant and nationalist sentiment that will end up kind of taking over that movement over the coming decades. We also get what's known as the War of Attrition, which is really just kind of an extended period of kind of attacks and counterattacks and skirmishes and terrorist attacks and Israel retaliations over these years. Hijackings and terrorist attacks kind of become a prominent way for people claiming to represent Palestinian interests, trying to bring attention to that cause. Interestingly, most most of the hijackings, which were, very kind of getting a lot of publicity and a lot of, created a lot of drama. They were perpetrated by a group called the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, who is not affiliated with the PLO. And in fact, often the PLO was opposed to the actions of the Popular Front because the PLO recognized that these hijackings were alienating the other Arab countries. And, by making the leaders look bad, by kind of forcing the leaders of these other Arab nations to kind of either acquiesce to the demands of the hijackers, which often meant, letting the planes land in Arab countries, kind of essentially either overtly or covertly supporting the acts of the Popular Front. And so it was actually viewed by the PLO and a lot of other kind of Palestinians as being counterproductive. Of course, the best known act of terrorism during this period is the attack during the Munich Olympics, which was carried out by a group that had dubbed itself Black September. And it was interesting to read, I shared, I think during the first session, the one of the books that I've kind of used in preparing for this class, which is the side by side, where it's kind of an Israeli telling of the history of the conflict and a Palestinian telling of the history of the conflict. And actually, I want to bring it up because I was so, and I think I talked a little bit about this last time. It's a valuable book for understanding the Palestinian point of view. I am finding it increasingly difficult to get through because not even because of some of the claims that they make, but more so because oftentimes the claims seem entirely at odds with not just like the Israeli perspective, but basically what everyone else in the world thinks. They also make some claims that I find problematic without any sort of proof or evidence to back them up.
Like, for example.
Well, we'll get to one in a little bit, but so just as a preview, when we talk about the first Intifada, one of the things that sparks it is an Israeli truck crashes into a Palestinian car in the Gaza Strip, killing 4 Palestinians. And the Palestinian historians claim outright that it was intentional, but they don't provide any evidence to support that. It's just, it feels like, and it feels like there's just an assumption that's the only option, that there's no way it could have just been an accident. And they could be right, it could have been intentional, but if you're going to make a claim like that, I feel like there needs to be some kind of something that you point to that says, it is believed to have been intentional, and here's why. You can't just say like, yeah, they did it on purpose. Well, how do you know that? I just do. Like that's not history. That's just making stuff up. So let me see if I can quickly find, yeah, okay, so I thought of that. So here, this is from the Palestinian kind of telling of what happened in the Munich Olympics. On the 5th of September, 1972, the same organization carried out the Munich operation, which targeted members of the Israeli Olympic team. The organization took 11 members of the Israeli team hostage and demanded the release of 200 Palestinians from Israeli prisons. Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir refused the Palestinian hijackers' demand and ordered an attack against them. All the kidnappers and hostages were killed during the attack. And then, as usual, the Israeli retaliation after the Munich operation was violent, and they go on to talk about that. So first of all, unless I'm drastically misremembering, there's been new, documentaries about this and all this kind of stuff. Not all of the terrorists were killed. Some of them were tracked down over, decades to, so just the way that's presented kind of gives me pause when I read other things, because it casts some doubts on the, I guess, how seriously to take the author, when you kind of put things out there that are patently false, or you make claims without any sort of evidence or justification. It makes it hard to then take as seriously other things that you may say, even if those things may end up being true.
Was
So-
it Germany that attacked, not, German forces went in to rescue them as opposed to Israeli forces?
Yeah, well, the whole thing, I mean, there's a great documentary and book. I forget, I think the documentary is based in the book, but I think the documentary won the Academy Award a bunch of years back for best documentary. It's called One Day in September. The book also, there's a book out that kind of traces the entirety of the whole experience. And the long way to answer that question is the entire operation was an absolute mess, and there's all sorts of problems with it from every direction. The way the Germans managed it was ridiculous and ended up being catastrophic. So there's all sorts of problems with the way that was handled. But I don't want to get too sidetracked on the Munich thing. The point of sharing that was that we had this 6-year period during which, even though there weren't any like official wars, it's not like things were, nice and calm. Like there was always stuff going on. There were always issues. So as we get into 72 and then 1973, actually even earlier than that, in 1971, Anwar Sadat launches what was thought of as a peace initiative, which was designed to get Israel to withdraw from the Suez Canal area, and opening up the waterway in exchange for a lasting ceasefire. So this wasn't like a peace agreement necessarily, but at least the idea was a long-term ceasefire with, if Israel was willing to kind of pull back a little bit. Israel essentially said, thanks, but no thanks. And then in part because of that, in part because of a few other things, a few months later, Sadat basically decided that the only way to try and get back the territory that had been lost in 1967 was through a military option. He initially sought weapons from the USSR to support this endeavor. The Soviets were reluctant to help him out and apparently were kind of jerks about it. And kind of treated Sadat and the Egyptians kind of as like beneath them in a lot of ways. But then Sadat announced that he was going to expel thousands of Soviet military advisors, and the Soviets, not wanting to lose kind of their influence in Egypt and the Middle East, agreed to supply Sadat with most of the weapons that he had asked for, most of the military technology that he had been seeking. So that's, kind of mid-71 into 1972. In April of 1973, Egypt and Syria forged an agreement to go to war together against Israel by the end of that year, by the end of 1973. They ended up picking Yom Kippur, which also happened to be the 10th day of Ramadan that year. It wasn't only picked because of the religious significance in that. I mean, they knew what the deal was with all of that. But also apparently it was the moonlight and tides were favorable at that time. And also they recognized that because it was Yom Kippur, a lot of Israeli soldiers would be at home or on leave. Radio and TV stations would be shut down. So communication would be more difficult. And that basically the idea was they thought they would catch Israel, to use an outdated term, like, with the pants down. And I mean, they did, really. They absolutely did that. The one thing that they didn't account for about doing it on Yom Kippur, which ended up helping Israel, is that, have any of you been in Israel on Yom Kippur? So the whole country like shuts down and there's no cars, like hardly any cars, there's no, like hardly any traffic at all. And probably even more so in 73, but what that meant is that it made mobilization a lot easier because they weren't having to deal with all these other people on the road or, getting into traffic or things like that. They were able to move quickly once they realized what was going on. I mentioned after 67, Israel was feeling very confident. I think it would be fair to say there was a certain level of arrogance about among Israelis about their status, their abilities, their military might, their intelligence operations. And also they didn't think that Egypt and Syria or that the Arab world was capable of sneaking up on them. They just didn't think they didn't believe that the Arab nations had the ability, the infrastructure, the discipline, any of the things to do that. Some of that was born out of some kind of just general anti-Arab sentiment. The IDF in particular tended to view the surrounding Arab armies as incompetent and weak. And again, like you can understand why they might think that, having just whooped them so severely in 67. But there's a sense that after 67, Israel thought like that there's no way that the Arab countries would ever attack them, because they had been beaten so badly that they wouldn't want to mess around anymore. Israel, among many others, had a pretty low opinion of Anwar Sadat, and thought he was kind of just like a ho-hum, almost like just like a functionary sort of leader, not someone who could really pull off any sort of major military operation. But they were wrong. They were really, really wrong. And interestingly, there's an assumption that when Egypt and Syria attacked in 73, that their goal was the destruction of Israel. But most of the sources, actually pretty much all the sources that I've seen, say that that's not actually what their goal was. Their goal was to reclaim the land that they had lost in 67. If Israel happened to get destroyed in the process, they weren't going to, lose any sleep over it. But what they believed, and where this belief came from was, I think, a combination of, it's one of those like where myth and fact kind of merge together to create a narrative that has elements of truth, but goes far beyond what the actual, reality is. There was a belief that if Israel were mortally threatened, they would use nuclear weapons. It was kind of a, worst secret ever that Israel was, had a nuclear program and was working on this. It's unclear in 73 exactly where they were in that process. But the assumption among the Arab nations was that if Israel felt like its existence was threatened, that they would turn to those in order to save themselves. And fortunately, we did not get to that. But I don't want to get into like the details of the war itself, because that doesn't really matter as much in this particular context. But we kind of know the general story. Like Israel was caught by surprise. Egypt and Syria made some pretty strong advancements early in the war, and then eventually Israel got its act together and was able to not only push them back, but even make further gains into Syria and into Egypt. And then eventually a ceasefire was put in place. And what's interesting is, so maybe the most important thing the way this war was viewed in the aftermath by Israel versus, as opposed to Egypt in particular, is really fascinating. Because Egypt especially viewed this as a victory. Like they were absolutely, they were pleased with the result. I mean, they would have liked to have kind of, I think, gotten Sinai back in that moment, but they basically they felt like, and this is probably a terrible analogy, so I admit that going forward. But I love a good sports analogy. And so, it's like in college sports, when you have like one of the big power teams that plays a team that is clearly not as talented or doesn't have the same resources or whatever, and the team that's not supposed to be able to compete gives them a really good game. Right, they give them a really close game, they really push them, they really force them to like play their best. Even though they lose, they feel pretty good about themselves. I feel like that's kind of where Egypt was. They're like, you know what, we took it to them. Like, yeah, we didn't win, but like we showed them that, we're not going to be just pushed around. We showed them that, they can't just walk all over us. And so because of that, there was a sense that again, Syria to a lesser extent, but Egypt especially, had kind of restored their honor, which then put their leaders in a position to start to potentially negotiate with Israel, and not do so from a position of like humiliating inferiority. So this, they kind of saved face enough that they felt like, okay, now we can have a conversation because I don't feel like you just, whoop my behind so badly. It kind of loosened up some of the like political logjam that had been in place in '67. It kind of put everyone in a place where there was a growing understanding that the only way that any territory was going to be shifted was through negotiations. Even though Israel kind of started off the war in a bad spot, the end result once again demonstrated their military prowess and that they were not likely to be defeated in a regular war. And that, again, the only way for anything to actually happen was going to be through negotiations. So on the flip side, I talked about Egypt feeling pretty good about themselves coming out of this. Israel was a bad scene. Like there was a lot of questions about how this could have happened. The government leadership was all taken to task. There were inquiries. It was, even though they won, in a lot of ways, it was viewed as a failure. Which, on the one hand, no one likes to feel like a failure. But on the flip side, kind of looking ahead, again, it put Israel in a place where they were more willing to listen to, options about territorial compromise, more open to negotiating with Egypt. And so, while it's kind of it was a weird space for all the sides to exist in, and the way we tend to think about winners and losers in military conflicts kind of gets flipped on its head. The end result, the most important end result, was that coming out of '73, both Israel and Egypt found themselves kind of in a spot where they were open to negotiations. Now, that is not the case with Syria. The Syrians were generally not interested in any sort of like real, truce of any kind. They were still pretty salty about how things played out. And I mean, some of that is connected to like the way the ceasefire and the truce ended up being set in terms of where the lines were drawn on the map and that sort of thing. But they never showed much interest in creating an environment that would lead to negotiation. So the eventual fruit of all of that is the Camp David Accords in '79. I'm not going to dwell on them because they're not necessarily directly related to the Israeli-Palestinian issue in a significant way. The one thing there's a couple things that it did do that are important for our particular conversation. The one is it kind of took Egypt out of the picture militarily. Egypt was no longer going to be a threat for war or anything like that. It kind of took Egypt out of the conversation about the fate of the Palestinians. The Palestinians and the other Arab countries, roundly rejected the agreement. In many cases, severed diplomatic ties with Egypt. Egypt was suspended from the Arab League, like pretty much like everyone else in the Arab world essentially thought that they had sold out. Which, reinforces what a incredible move it was for it to happen, and how much courage it took. But the biggest thing maybe that came out of this is it created a precedent. Now, how strong of a precedent depends a lot on who you ask, but it did create a precedent of exchanging land for peace. Because up to that point, Israel had been pretty reluctant to do anything like that, to trade territory for ceasefires or peace or anything like that. But this kind of created that template, which then, 15 years later, helped make Oslo possible. It also essentially just removed that argument from the conversation that, we can never do this, we can never do this, okay, well, now we've done it, so that's not really an issue anymore. Granted, it was still an issue for a lot of people, but in terms of like the kind of diplomatic universe, that stumbling block had been removed. So, beginning in the late 70s, or so in the early 70s, let me back up for a second. So the PLO, yes.
So I know that there's kind of a big jump between April of 73, when we had the Yom Kippur War, and now we're making peace with Camp David in 1979. So what made Egypt want to come to the table and willing to negotiate a peace treaty with Israel? Specifically, was there a change in leadership? What might have prompted that? So,
we have to keep in mind that Egypt actually made overtures toward this in 1971. They were the first, they actually took the very first step. They were the ones who kind of put out this idea of, we are willing to sign onto a long-term ceasefire in exchange for Israel pulling back from parts of Sinai and the Suez Canal. And then after the war, there was kind of this collective sense of, all right, this is no gain is going to come militarily. So the only way we, meaning Egypt, are gonna get what we want, which is we want Sinai back, is through conversation. And then, it really took a change on Israel, from Israel's side, to be open to that more so than from the Egyptian side, because they had shown a willingness to do that. Then when Israel rebuffed them, they were kind of like, all right, we'll forget you then, we'll, fight it out. But then after the fighting it out really didn't get anyone anywhere, there was a return to like, okay, you know what? This is the only way that anything is going to get accomplished. And there are steps along the way in terms of like diplomatic steps. But since it's not critical to our understanding of the Israeli-Palestinian issue, I didn't want to get into the details of that process too deeply.
Right. I guess the only thing I would say is it does strike me as rather remarkable that an Arab-led country was willing to come to the table, and there was the ability to achieve this, given the current situation, which again, as you state, is completely different. But it does, in what you've been sharing, Rabbi, with the book too, I just find it intriguing that they were able to come to this trade-off, because there's really been nothing since then, in my opinion, that equals that or comes close to that. I mean, Oslo was kind of headed that way, but, you know, completely fell apart.
I mean, I think the other thing that's important to keep in mind with that bit specifically, is that to a large, and so this is, I would say this is a, this is not an official opinion, but it is I would like to call it a well-informed opinion. Israel didn't feel about Sinai the way it does about the West Bank and Gaza. Actually, I think Israel would love to be rid of Gaza, and tried, but obviously that didn't work out so well. But Israel feels far more strongly about the West Bank and the Golan Heights relative to Sinai. I mean, I think there's always been elements within Israeli society, within the political realm, who have advocated for kind of a, what's often called like the greater Israel, which includes Sinai, which includes, it's basically the Israeli version of like from the river to the sea. But the amount of people who were really who really cared deeply about holding on to the Sinai Peninsula they were not as many, and they were not as strong as those who feel the same way about the West Bank. So I think that was part of it. I also think it was just a function of, leaders and people in power who kind of recognized that they had a moment, and two sides who were really kind of tired of fighting each other, who recognized that nothing was going to be accomplished from this. And for Israel to, if it meant that they could basically ignore one of the fronts that they had been having to deal with, like that was a huge win for them. And the territorial concession seemed like a reasonable one, given what they felt like they would gain from it. But this was not like, point, from A to Z in a heartbeat. Like there's a lot of stuff that happened in between, diplomatically, politically, otherwise. But like I said, since it's not directly related to the Israeli-Palestinian stuff, I didn't want to dwell on it too deeply. All right, so let's keep on rolling. So I was starting to say, so in the early 70s, the Palestinians, the PLO had been based out of Jordan, and then the Jordanians kind of got sick of them being there and launched a massive assault against the PLO, which resulted in the PLO moving to southern Lebanon. And then as a result of this, much of southern Lebanon and all of the Palestinian refugee camps that existed there became essentially an armed state within a state. And it served as a base for terrorist groups like Black September, the Baader Meinhof gang, the Japanese Red Army faction, all of whom took part in hijackings or terrorist attacks against Israel or other Jewish targets. The Lebanese government was not particularly strong, and so they were, well, there's a question of whether they were unable or unwilling to restrain the PLO and the Palestinian, kind of the guerrilla warfare. Even though that these raids and these attacks brought significant Israeli retaliation and did a lot of damage to Lebanon, they, for a variety of reasons, there wasn't the kind of political or military will to really do something about it from within Lebanon. This was going to be even more difficult because in the mid-70s, in April of 1975, there's the outbreak of essentially a Lebanese civil war, which was primarily between the Christian communities within Lebanon. This was something that had built up over a lot of years, and there was a lot of tension, and it kind of finally exploded into this, civil war. Israel, of course, both overtly and covertly, hoped for a Christian victory, because they believed that were the Christians to be victorious, that it would be beneficial to Israel, that they would be willing to enter into a peace agreement with Israel. It would also just kind of, there's also a sense that it would result in the destruction of the PLO, or at least the removal from Lebanon. But that didn't really happen. The civil war kind of raged on. Actually, it kind of raged on until like into the 90s, in various fits and starts. In the late 70s, we have a bus hijacking near Haifa. And in response to this, and this was not the first time this had happened, like there had been stuff going on, these guerrilla raids and kind of terrorist attacks and this other kind of stuff. But this, this one proved to be kind of a bridge too far. And so in response to it, in addition to everything that led up to it, Israel launched what was called Operation Litani, which is based on the rivers in Lebanon. The operation began in March 15th of 1978. There are a few different aims of this. One was to kill as many of the Palestinian guerrilla fighters as possible and to destroy the PLO's military infrastructure. The second aim was to expand the Christian-held enclaves on the Lebanese side of the border, and ideally create some continuity between both those enclaves and Israel. So Israel launches this operation. Interestingly, Syria doesn't interfere. The US and Western Europe kind of,
Recording in progress.
shoulders and whoa. Can we make sure everyone has their mics turned off, please? We're getting some echo in here, which is kind of trippy and fun, but less conducive to what we're doing. Okay, I think that's better. So, in spite of the, always strained relationship between Israel and Syria, the Syrians were kind of like, hey, you know what, you do you, we're not getting involved. The US and Western Europe, shrugged their shoulders and said, hey, you probably shouldn't do that, but they didn't really do a whole lot about it. And what ended up happening is the establishment of a Christian-dominated, what was called security zone inside of Lebanon. So basically from the Lebanese and Israeli border northward, an area of land that was controlled by the Christians, which meant that it was not a place from which the PLO would launch attacks or anything else. It was a buffer zone. And following this, Operation Litani, there was kind of like a pretty regular back and forth between the PLO and Israel in terms of military style actions. There were guerrilla attacks or terrorist attacks. Israel would respond with either bombings or brief incursions. The PLO started launching rocket attacks against northern Israeli towns, especially Kiryat Shmona and Nahariya. If you've ever been to Kiryat Shmona, you will see that it is shockingly close to the Lebanon border. And in fact, so the first time I lived in Israel, I was part of a group, and for part of this program, we were sent in like little groups of, anywhere from 4 to 8 to different towns for like 4 months. And one of the groups was sent to Kiryat Shmona. And, it became just kind of like a semi-regular occurrence where like the alarms would go off, they would go into the bomb shelter, they'd wait, 30 minutes, an hour, whatever it was, get the all clear, and they'd come back up. And, there was never any significant damage that took place, but it was just one of those things that became a part of their lives for those months, which you could imagine if you're dealing with this for years or even, decades, like the toll that might take on someone. In fact, it resulted in a lot of people leaving Kiryat Shmona. I think I read like 40% of the population ended up leaving over time. So this was going on for a few years, and then in kind of the mid to late 1981, Israel, who's really getting tired of this, started looking for a reason to invade Lebanon with the idea that, with the goal of destroying the PLO's military infrastructure, which, even though there were, little pieces here and there that were going on, by most accounts, like the year beginning in, again, like late 81, actually, it was kind of quiet from like July of 81 to June of 1982. There were actually fewer incidents than there had been in the previous years. And Israel's goal wasn't simply just to dismantle the PLO for its own sake, but there's a belief that the destruction of the PLO and its ejection from Lebanon would actually give Israel a freer hand in determining the fate of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. In fact, there was some hope that the Palestinians might just give up on their national aspirations altogether, or maybe start looking to Jordan as a place where they could fulfill those aspirations. And interestingly, Ariel Sharon, who we're going to be talking more about in a minute, and I'm going to use this as a wonderfully complex character in Israel's history. But he told associates in June of 1982 that Israel might be willing to help overthrow the Hashemites, the rulers of Jordan, and to further the Jordan is Palestine solution, which, while I'm glad that never came to pass, the idea of that is fascinating to consider, because there's so many problems with it, but it's one of those thought exercises that you kind of wonder what might have been or what could have transpired. I don't think anything good would have come out of it in the end, but it's an interesting thing it's an interesting side route to follow. It was believed, there was hope for that, if Israel is able to go in and dismantle the PLO, that a Christian dominated Lebanon would be an ally, would sign a peace agreement. There's also the hope that in the process of dealing with the PLO, that Israel might be able to kind of push any Syrian forces out of Lebanon who had kind of started to mill about and have some influence there. Yes.
Right. As this was going on, Amy and I were busy having children and raising little kids, and our focus wasn't all on this, though we have a family in Israel, but obviously compared to now. But at this point, was there within the country a large or noticeable Palestinian concern on the order, maybe not the order of what we're seeing now, but was there a constant effort across the board? Universities, political
Effort
to stand for the Palestinian cause
amongst Israelis?
No, here.
Oh,
Like
in the
where it's
US?
here, yeah, like here.
I don't think so. Particularly after Munich and after 73, with the hijackings and all these other things that the PLO and then some of the non-PLO organizations have been doing, I think there was generally a pretty, at least in the United States, there was not a lot of love for the Palestinian cause.
That's what I thought. I just wanted to make sure that I.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that was also, I mean, to be honest, I would imagine that it just wasn't something that was on most people's radar in general. And for those whom it was my guess, at least, it was not a great, not a lot of happy feelings towards the Palestinians. And then also, I mean, if you think about all the other stuff that was going on with some of the other Arab countries and OPEC and all that kind of stuff, and I think there was kind of a overall sentiment that was not super fond of the Arab world during that time.
We're also focused on Vietnam.
True.
Right.
Except for Vanessa Ring.
Oh, yes. Exactly.
I had to check when that was. That was 1978 Academy.
That's what Vanessa read.
So there were, I mean, someone was talking about it then, but clearly maybe not at the level it is now.
Right.
And it's, I mean, and we'll kind of get into a little more of this when we start getting to the Intifada and then beyond, but you know, the Palestinian cause really started to kind of take off in a positive way, I think, with the first Intifada, in terms of, like, for lack of a better way of putting it, public relations. That is really I think one of the biggest shifts happens in terms of how they were viewed, because I think, and again, this is kind of a guess based on things I've read and people I've talked to and everything else. Even though I was alive, I was not old enough to really be super attuned to a lot of these things. You know, I think I was 6 in 1982, so you know, I was not really up on Middle Eastern policy or conflicts or whatnot. I liked snacks. Yes, still do. So with the stuff going on in Lebanon, you know, and at the time, you know, we have to remember who was in the government in Israel. It was Begin with Ariel Sharon as his defense minister, and you know, Begin had gained a lot of international political capital with Camp David, and in some ways, I think maybe believed that he could spend some of that political capital kind of in the international realm on this, what he wanted to do in Lebanon. But a lot of what happens kind of starting in 82 and beyond is really driven by Ariel Sharon. And I'm going to talk more to that in just a second. So for a little while, Begin and Sharon and some of the other ministers who kind of were in their cohort were looking. They were looking for a reason to start something. You know, they were looking for a fight. Like they wanted to go in and try and deal with the PLO and like for once and for all. So they were really looking for any excuse to go and do this. And they found one when Israel's ambassador in London, whose name was Shlomo Argov, was shot. He wasn't killed, fortunately, but he was shot by what were believed to be Palestinian terrorists. But interestingly, it was clear to pretty much everyone, and most people think, including Begin and Sharon and the Israeli government, that this attack was not carried out by the PLO, that this was by an Iraqi-based terrorist group known as the Abu Nidal group, who was hoping to provoke an attack by Israel against Lebanon. And in fact, the PLO actually put out a statement deploring the attack on Shlomo Argov. But in spite of this, you know, like I said, when you are someone who's looking to start a fight, you will find any reason you can to start that fight, even if the reasons, and you know, both in the moment and in hindsight, prove to be a little sketchy. So in the lead up to the implementation of this attack on Lebanon, there's a lot of shady dealing by Ariel Sharon. And I mean, there's just no way to get around it. There's no way to sugarcoat it. He was doing some sketchy stuff. You know, the plans that he was presenting were intentionally extremely vague. Even when he was pressed on certain matters, there was a lot of like, well, you know, things happen and we'll just have to see how it goes. But you know, it'll be fine. Everything's gonna be fine. Don't worry about it. And when an action was eventually approved, it was what was approved was a very limited incursion. In fact, the ministers who approved it, like there was specific statements that the IDF was not to go to Beirut, that you know they were to kind of deal with this like southern section of Lebanon where the PLO was as much as possible. But you know that it was supposed to be limited, you know, and Sharon talked about it being a 24-hour operation, which turned into like 24 years. And you know, as this attack was going on, you know, started and then was in process, you know, Sharon would routinely kind of step outside the bounds of what had been approved. He would often present misleading information about what the plans were in order to get ministerial support. Sometimes he would go to, you know, the ministers to get approval for things that he was already doing. If there were anyone who lived the, you know, ask for forgiveness instead of permission, it was Ariel Sharon. And he actually didn't really ask for forgiveness either. He was just gonna like, I'm just gonna do what I do and y'all just have to deal. So, you know, Israel goes into Lebanon in June of 1982, and pretty quickly like makes its way towards Beirut. They inflict a considerable amount of damage on the PLO and their infrastructure. They are successful in eliminating a number of the guerrilla fighters. They also, in the process, there are more civilian casualties than one would generally want or expect for this kind of operation. And then
On the Israeli side, or both?
On the Israelis inflicted
Okay.
more civilian casualties than one would normally hope for or expect in this kind of situation. And then, so, you know, this operation starts in early June of 1982, and by early July, Arafat basically shares that he is willing to evacuate Beirut. He kind of sees the writing on the wall. He understands and is also being told by pretty much anyone who can reach him that this is not good. You are in a bad place and you are making this bad for everybody else. So by the end of July, there was an Arab created plan that was almost unanimously endorsed and supported by the United States for Arafat and kind of the PLO and the Palestinians who are still in Lebanon to be evacuated out of Beirut and Lebanon. And even after this, in early August, Israel was launching airstrikes against Beirut, many of which were, it's harder to know how they were viewed in the moment, but I know that there are reports that even in real time, there was a lot of like, what are we doing here? Like, what is the point of this? Some other military actions that were believed to be superfluous and geared more towards just punishment than actual any sort of strategy. And so it left a lot of people, a lot of Israelis starting to feel really uncomfortable with how this was all going. Like there's reports of like platoon leaders basically saying like, I'm almost like essentially disobeying orders and saying like, I'm not gonna do this. There is no purpose to me leading my men into this attack. So, you know, if you want to do this, that's cool. You know, you can put me with the infantry. I'm not leading this.
Rabbi, any corollaries to what's going on now with civilians in Palestine?
I mean, you could draw some comparisons to what's going on now where there's not that, you know, there's never been in Israel's history, in anything that I've ever seen, read, heard, whatever, where inflicting civilian casualties was an intentional part of the strategy. And there have been times where the importance of protecting the civilian population has not been as high of a priority as it has been in other circumstances. I mean, I think, again, that's one of those things that it feels uncomfortable to say and it feels uncomfortable to know, but there's just no way around it. Like that's just, and so there's a great book, so many great books. And some of you may have read it already. If you haven't, and you like studying Israel history stuff, Rise and Kill First. It's a history of Israel's targeted assassination program. It's a spectacular book. Barak Ravid, I think, is the author. But one of the things that he kind of shows in his history is that over time, at least in some, particularly in like certain circles, the importance of minimizing civilian casualties becomes less important. And, you know, and that is reflective of a lot of different things, but I think in this case, when we're talking about Lebanon, I don't think I can overstate the amount of, I think, anger and frustration that was felt within Israeli society towards the PLO and towards the Palestinians. And, you know, and Ariel Sharon is someone who had been known for years to be kind of, I mean, this is maybe a little bit minimizing, but like he was a known hothead. He was someone who was known to, it's one of the things that made him an incredible military leader at times, but it was also a, you know, essentially led to his at least temporary downfall. And so, you know, there's a lot of stuff that happens kind of towards the end of the major part of the operation that are viewed as that are thought to have been not necessary. But the end result of all of this is that the PLO and the Palestinians are evacuated out of Lebanon. The PLO is reestablished. They reestablished their headquarters in Tunisia. So that's the leadership. Other members of the PLO and other Palestinians were sent to various Middle Eastern and African countries. And then, you know, I'll speak a little more to kind of some of the fallout from this in just a second, but, you know, Israel remains in Lebanon for decades. And it became kind of an albatross. And it became something that within Israeli society was viewed in some ways as kind of indicative of some of the excesses of Israel's kind of military because over the years, like hundreds of soldiers were killed in Lebanon. And at a certain point, actually not even at a certain point, like almost from the beginning, a lot of Israelis were kind of like, what's the point of this? Like, what are we doing here? Why are we sacrificing our soldiers for what feels like nothing? Because it's not like, you know, the rockets stopped being shot from Lebanon. It's not like, you know, there's any lasting gain from this. And so it was one of those things that just felt like a quagmire that Israel was unwilling to get themselves out of, for a whole variety of reasons. But kind of after the evacuation of the PLO, there were still Palestinian refugee camps in and around Beirut. So not all of the Palestinians were evacuated. And the IDF gave the mission of eliminating opposition in these camps to what were known as the Christian phalanges. I may be butchering that name, but basically the Christian militia who had been fighting kind of with Israel against the PLO and the Lebanese Muslims. And one of the camps that they were given that they were kind of told to deal with, or two of the camps that they were told to deal with were called Sabra and Shatila. And these Christian soldiers embarked on what they essentially viewed as a purification operation in these camps, which resulted in the pretty brutal murder of hundreds of Palestinian civilians, including a lot of women and children. Israel was largely held responsible for this massacre on the world stage. And within Israel, a commission of inquiry was established to kind of look into what happened. And the commission determined that the responsibility fell entirely on the Christian militia, but also noted that there had been a series of errors and missteps made by the IDF kind of in and around this whole situation. And this led to the removal of Ariel Sharon as defense minister. And if memory serves me correctly, he kind of fell off the map for a long time after this. Like I think whether it was, biding his time or whether he kind of felt like he had been scolded and, went to his corner to pout. I don't know, but he kind of was out of the picture in any sort of significant way for a while.
What year was that, Rabbi?
The inquiry? I think, I don't know. I don't want to say, because I don't know off the top of my head what year the inquiry took place. But I can find that and let y'all know.
What year is the Sabra and Shatila?
Yeah, because then he came back and really screwed things up in 2000.
Right, well, that's the thing, is like he was kind of off out of the game for a while, and then when he came back in a way that only he could, and caused all sorts of issues for all sorts of people. But like I said, he is a wonderfully complex character in Israel's history. Which you could say about a lot of these guys, actually. Like there's a lot of the people who are part of the early years of Israel's growth and into the 70s and 80s too. They were complicated figures. Begin is another great example. He was, a super interesting, complicated guy, but he did some great things. He did some terrible things, but there's a great biography about Begin by, I think it's Daniel Gordis is the author, but it's another book worth reading. So the Lebanon War, as it is, known, is generally viewed as Israel's first military defeat. And it stung, like it definitely stung both, it stung Israel's pride. It also stung the military establishment, because they lost the faith of, a segment of the population, the Israeli population. So what ended up happening when it all was said and done is Israel basically pulled back from Beirut to a distance of about, well, I'll use the imperial system, 28 miles, or 45 kilometers for you metric system fans, from Israel's northern border, and created a security zone, which would remain in effect for a very long time. One of the other kind of results of all of this is that Syria ended up increasing their presence in Lebanon. And in a way, you can make a very legit case that while the PLO military infrastructure in Lebanon was destroyed, it was replaced by Hezbollah. So it's, you know, not really a win. You know, and Hezbollah has from that point till today been a thorn in Israel's side. And they're particularly problematic because regardless of what they may say, Hezbollah is not a Palestinian group. They are an Iranian group. And while they may claim to, you know, act on behalf of the Palestinians, their focus is far more about the destruction of Israel than it is the, you know, creating anything for the Palestinians. Yeah.
So on that note, and I don't want to get too far off topic, but a huge event happens in 1979. The Shah is overthrown and this theocracy comes in Iran. Now we're talking about Hezbollah, and we know, at least currently, the thinking is, or the knowledge is, that Hezbollah serves as proxies for Iran. So my question just is this: is Iran in the equation with Israel's defense, and like we need to watch them at this time? Or when does the whole Iran angle of this start to enter into the whole Israel's equation?
I mean, they kind of they start to become an issue with the, you know, the kind of insertion of Hezbollah. But in terms of Iran being a major part of the conversation, at least from what I know, like that's a more recent kind of situation. Even with the, you know, the rise of Ayatollah Khomeini and all of that, the kind of specific Israel-Iran problems are more recent than this. I mean, I think that we start to see the emergence of them in the early 80s, but you know, we have to remember Iran was also involved in a war with Iraq, and they had their own problems that they were dealing with, and they had all sorts of other stuff going on. So at the moment, Israel was not a primary concern of theirs, but it becomes one in part, I think. This is just my own conjecture, I suppose. I think when Iran realizes that they can kind of use Israel as like their own little punching bag, that's when they start to kind of have a more vocal role in all of this. So I mean, the PLO, the infrastructure in Lebanon is destroyed. The organization is driven out of Beirut, but it's not like the PLO is gone. You know, they end up in Tunisia, they reestablish themselves, they continue different sorts of operations. But interestingly, what some of the writers that I've been looking at claim, and I can see where they come from with this, is that this may have actually led to a moderation of the PLO's positions. In a sense, basically like similar to, almost in a way similar to what happened with Egypt, a sense of, you know, okay, we can't win militarily. So now what? You know, and eventually, which it feels like a long time afterwards, but I guess in the grand scheme, it's not, so this is stuff is happening in 1982 in Lebanon. And then in 1988, we get a declaration from Arafat recognizing Israel and repudiating terrorism. And now we can talk about what that meant in real life as opposed to, words on a page, so to speak. But it's there, however we may, choose to look at it in hindsight. So in a weird sort of backwards way, Begin and Sharon, who's one of their big hopes had been to use this as a means to eventually annex the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, strangely kind of began the process of creating an atmosphere that led to the PLO's eventual authority in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So it, in that case, it is an absolute abject failure. I said before, like what happened in Lebanon, like kind of created in some cases or exacerbated in other cases already existing divides within Israeli society, and it's a failure among the government and the military. And it also, to be blunt, like it pissed off everyone in Lebanon who were not the Christians. And the biggest problem with that is that some of those groups were not outwardly antagonistic to Israel beforehand, but were very much antagonistic to Israel afterwards, including the Shiite Muslim community in Lebanon. So like, not only just from like a pure military perspective was this not successful, but like it really, the levels to which this screwed things up in a lot of different ways it's hard to number all of them because it was a mess from the jump. And again, a big part of that I think is because the goals of the operation there were too many goals that did not all fit together. That combined with Sharon's kind of lack of transparency in what he was planning to do, what he was hoping to do, some of the kind of ethical concerns that started to emerge in the process of all of this, it was a bad scene. It was a bad scene all around, and remains kind of one of Israel's great failures since its birth. So, fast forward a few years, and we get into the mid 80s, and all the fabulous hairstyles that came with it, and the increasingly questionable music choices, but I digress. New wave forever. So in 1987, we have the outbreak of what's known as the first Intifada. So this is a pivotal moment, and to understand kind of how we got here, we're going to kind of back up just a little bit. So I kind of talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but starting post 67, we have the growth of the settler movement, where people were going into the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, into Sinai, into the Golan Heights, and creating towns, communities, building houses, doing all that kind of stuff. And this movement it starts off in a lot of cases relatively benign. I mean, like I said, if you go back and you kind of either read about people or talk to people who were involved at the beginning, in a lot of cases, the reasons for wanting to settle in these places had nothing to do with ideology. It was, I can have a bigger house and a nice yard and all these other things if I go and live in these places, as opposed to like living in an apartment in Tel Aviv. And so like it was just pragmatic for a lot of people. But I mean, it's like any place, like, it's like you know, when you have, you know, when suddenly you have this option to move into a suburb, even if it feels a little far flung, it's like, okay, well, I can have a, you know, 2-bedroom apartment, or I can have a 4-bedroom house with a yard for less money. Like it's, so, you know, you can see why it would have been appealing to a lot of people. But within this movement, kind of, and I would argue that it certainly over time, it has become the majority of this movement. How quickly that happened is hard to say. But it becomes increasingly militant and nationalistic. And in fact, and I hadn't known about this before, but I was interested to read it. So in April of 1984, Israeli security uncovered a well-trained and organized Jewish underground comprising several dozen young residents of settlements, including some military officers and you kind of well-experienced soldiers who murdered Arab political leaders and carried out other terror attacks between 1980 and 1984. And so that's just to kind of emphasize that there was this element within the settler movement. You know, the percentages and whatever are hard to come by, but to imagine that it's like a more modern problem is not the case. Like we see, you know, as early as the early 80s, that this was an issue. So, you know, what are the things that kind of lead to the outbreak of the Intifada in terms of like the experience of Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip? So for one, they encounter basically daily humiliations at the hands of Israeli soldiers. Some of those are things that I would imagine that the soldiers had no choice but to do. You know, things at checkpoints, you know, searches, you know, some searches of cars or homes. But there were a lot of things that happened that were unnecessary and kind of beyond the scope of what the soldiers in these areas should have been doing. You know, the general attitude towards the Palestinians, not only from soldiers, but from Israelis in general. Palestinian workers were often treated really badly. You know, in terms of just like day-to-day life, you know, permits were required for like every little tiny thing, and the process of getting those permits was, you know, makes our bureaucratic red tape, you know, look like tissue paper. While there were some searches of cars and homes and stuff that were justified, there were a lot that in hindsight were more just to harass than for any legitimate reason. So, you know, so all of these are happening on a day-to-day basis. And if they're not happening to you, they're happening to someone you know, or you see it happening to someone you don't know. But all of these things just emphasize and reemphasize the Palestinians' status as a conquered and occupied people. And, you know, this, in addition to efforts that were made either by the government or by settler communities or whatever, to thwart any real attempts at economic progress, professional progress, you know, educational progress. So that's one, that's a big part. I mean, just like the daily grind of being under, you know, Israeli military rule is something that was wearing people down. Palestinians became increasingly disenchanted with their own leadership, in part because they felt like, you know, the PLO leadership was off in Tunisia, you know, thousands of miles away. And there was a sense that they didn't really understand what was happening on the ground, that they weren't dealing with it. Like they weren't living this on a day-to-day basis. And so they couldn't understand the hardships that regular Palestinian people were facing. And there is also a sense, that the Palestinians felt like and this is a quote from one of the books, that they felt the ground giving way underfoot. What does that mean? We're talking about like ground in like almost a literal sense, that the land itself was being kind of taken from them, which is not wrong. Israel took control of all of the water resources in the West Bank and began diverting most of that water to the settlements. Israel did seize a considerable amount of Palestinian land, including privately owned land, and then used that to build new settlements. There was an annexation of most of East Jerusalem and the Old City, and then a ring of new Jewish neighborhoods were built around that. Governance of the West Bank and Gaza was given to a civil administration, an Israeli civil administration, that controlled, basically everything. Appointments of government paid jobs, which included teachers, school curriculums, newspapers, the economy, taxes. The whole bureaucracy was under Israeli control. And that, along with the ubiquitous presence of the Israeli security services, like, you can understand how all of these things, if you are living in this day to day, like, yeah, you're going to be mad and you're going to be frustrated and you're going to want to do something about it, because that's not a way to live. So, and again, like, part of why I wanted to make sure to kind of emphasize this is, we can feel however we feel about the result, about, the Intifada itself. But I think it's fair to say, like, it's understandable why people were mad. Like, we can see why people were upset and wanted to do something about it. So the final spark of all this was, and I talked about this earlier, was December 8th, 1987. There's this Israeli truck that crashed into a Palestinian car in Gaza, killing 4 Palestinian passengers. The Palestinians then and now believe that it was intentional. There's no evidence to prove either way of this, but that is what the belief was. And at a certain point, this is one of those things where, and I say this knowing how it sounds, but at a certain point, the truth just isn't that important anymore. When we're talking about, this is a thing that's always been an issue when we talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is, truth and narrative. And at a certain point, as much as we want truth to be the most important thing, for a lot of people, it's just not. And also, and this is something that I discovered when during the second Intifada, when I was doing work for the Israeli government, which is that when all of your arguments, or when all of the things you're saying in favor of your side begin, well, technically, you're never going to win those arguments. Like, it doesn't matter how many facts you have in the court of public opinion, which, whether we like it or not, much of this is tried. Narrative is going to be more powerful than facts much of the time. Yeah.
You just said a whole bunch in about 1 minute. That's a whole bunch to take in.
Yeah.
But I appreciate your saying it and getting this group to that point. In less than 30 seconds, my uncle, who's gone now, knew Ariel Sharon on different levels. And 25, 30 years ago, when we were with him, a little more than that, actually predicted all of this under his mindset. It was really interesting. You and I can talk later.
They were in prison together.
Yeah.
So.
You got a rod for your cellies, right? But yeah, and I know, saying something like that, where the narrative is more, I'm not saying the narrative is more important than the facts on in a vacuum, but, and again, I first really realized this during the second Intifada, because I would go into these debates with, Palestinians or, Palestinian representatives with my exceptionally long list of facts and information and be like, but wait a second, this is true, and this is true, and this is true, and it just didn't matter. It just didn't matter, because when, like I said, when your arguments all start with, well, technically, like you've already lost the debate. And we can feel however we feel about that. We can think whatever we think about it. In a perfect world, everything would be solely based on fact. But we don't live in a perfect world, so we gotta deal with what we gotta deal with.
So we did a great job, the Jews, of being in control of the banking industry in the United States and the professions and the science and everything else. How do we miss advertising?
Well, it's, I mean, funny is not the word, because it's not funny, but like the idea that, Jews run the media. It's like, have you followed the media on some of this stuff? Like, if we're running the media, we're doing a really crappy job of, putting our side out there.
Or we are being truthful about what we're saying, as opposed to creating a false narrative, or not even false, but a supportive narrative to make a point, just to make a point for our side or their side. And I feel that you're talking about, it's a very tricky issue, I think, but how do I say this? It's been my experience, I don't know if truth is equally valued in different cultures. Now that is gonna be, probably gonna get a lot of people get upset with me, but I'm kind of seeing this now. I think we're operating from two different core value systems in some respects, or what we prioritize. And so maybe, as you're saying, facts maybe isn't part of a cultural, sociological tenet of some groups, whereas for others, especially those in the West, I believe most of the time it is.
So I mean, that's an also lot. But so I guess, so in terms of like the media, how the media portrays the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, there have been, because if it were simply that the media is putting out like truth and people don't want to believe it or whatever, then that is what it is. But there have been numerous situations in which things were distorted in order to fit a particular narrative. And this, over the years, this has gone both ways. Over the last 20 years, I would say that more often this has been used to, for lack of a better term, I feel like I've been saying that a lot, to demonize Israel. There are examples from the Second Intifada of photographs being misrepresented or kind of put, or given captions that are entirely at odds with what actually is happening in the picture. Pictures that are being manipulated to show something that, when you look at it from this one particular angle, looks one way, but when you look at it from any other angle, looks entirely different. So again, I don't want to this is not meant to be like a damn the media sort of thing. But getting back to kind of what I was starting to say originally is, to speak to the issue of truth, actually, I wanted to say one thing. I talked about this during the first session, and this is part of the challenge with this topic, is that often there are kind of two truths that exist simultaneously, but the way you look at them is going to impact how you, like the weight that you put on one versus the other. Like when we talk about the peace process, depending on the perspective that you want to take, you could absolutely make a case that Israel was at fault for its failure, or that the Palestinians were at fault for its failure, because they both screwed up a lot. And it's just a matter of which screw ups do you want to emphasize. And so, I want to be careful about kind of putting an idea that there's one culture or side that values truth more than the other. I think oftentimes it's, there are kind of parallel truths that exist. And it's just a matter, and that part of why, I like doing things like this is to try and A, point out that reality, and B, to give us as much information as possible so that when we encounter multiple truths, we can say, okay, based on what I know, based on, this, that, and the other thing, I kind of feel like this seems like it makes more sense to me than this one does. But like in the great reform tradition of informed choice, my part of my goal is to inform, and then you get to make a choice.
Rabbi.
Oh,
Sorry.
so I want to actually just really quickly, because it's already 7:37. I want to really quickly get through some of the stuff with the Intifada, and then I will try and address any questions that remain. So after this, truck crashes into a Palestinian car. At the funeral for those killed in this crash, the funeral kind of turned into a bit of a riot. The crowd attacked an IDF post in Gaza by throwing stones. And then the rioting kind of just continued on over the following days and weeks and years, thus marking the start of the Intifada. Originally, the Intifada was primarily driven by women and kids who threw stones, who threw, depending on reports, some say Molotov cocktails at IDF soldiers and vehicles. They confronted the IDF in Gaza at various spots. And then pretty soon after that, things started up in the West Bank as well. They blocked streets, a lot of those kinds of protests. In the Israeli army, they were absolutely unprepared for this kind of thing. They had no idea what to do with these sort of demonstrations. And unfortunately, the route they chose was to, and this is a quote, to batter the demonstrators with all possible force. So, again, not in hindsight, probably not the best choice, but oftentimes choices made in crises in hindsight are, we would have chosen differently.
Don't
But
we have a member of Congress that's, she's a woman and she's Palestinian, and she keeps talking about.
yeah, Rashida Tlaib, I think is her
Yes,
name.
she keeps talking about, how the Palestinians are being heard and how they're being, she's publicly talking about how the Palestinians are wrong. Or no, how the Israelis are wrong. And so it's, that's inciting some of this.
I mean, I think a singular American politician speaking out on this, I don't think actually moves the needle that much.
Right.
Outside of the American Jewish community, and particularly in maybe her district. But yeah, there's people on all sides of this, and there always have been, kind of saying different things. Some who say things that are well thought out and informed, and some who say things that are neither.
Rabbi.
And on all sides of things. So, yeah.
Oh, he's
Yes.
being, yeah, I think there are all sorts of truths. I think, having lived through this throughout the whole trajectory, the settler movement has changed the American Jewish defense of Israel dramatically. Until the settler movement, it was just easy to defend Israel, to be 100% Israel is totally right. Now, many Jews who, and I would say myself, who value all people, find it impossible to defend the settler movement. And the question was asked before, when did the protests against Israel start in America? I think you can date a lot of it to the settler movement. So that's another truth. There is our truth as American Jews. You know, there's the Palestinian truth in terms of the way they see the settler movement. There's the, you know, the religious Zionist truth, the way they see it. But we have a truth also. And one of the heartbreaking things today is we as American Jews are very much on the defensive. And a lot of that can be dated, in my mind, at least in my personal experience, to the settler movement.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think the settler movement raises a lot of issues for American Jews for a bunch of different reasons. Some of them are kind of just what the goals of the movement are. I think some of it is that the people who have often represented the settler movement have not always come across as, warm, cuddly kind of folks. And to be honest, I do think that, at least in some circles, the orthodoxy of much of the settler movement is something that American Jews are uncomfortable with, in part because it seems to, I think for a lot of people, it puts forward this idea that this is a Jewish value to settle in these areas, when so many people don't believe that to be the case. I want to power through here so we can kind of get at least through the Intifada stuff, and then we'll set up a time to do round 4, because there's just so much. Man, oh man, I love it. All right, so as I was saying, initially the Intifada was, it was a ground up movement. This is not something where it was orchestrated by the PLO or anything else. In fact, in some ways, it was a response to the PLO's lack of initiative and lack of action that this happened. Like I say, the Israeli army did not know what to do with themselves. They did not know how to respond to this, and often responded poorly. Including many reports from the field state that people, sometimes entire families, were being beaten in their own homes without cause. And there's a lot of violence done in response, to the Palestinians in response to this. The IDF, in fact, eventually issued restrictions on what kind of force could be used, because they, were just not, even within Israel, there were a lot of people like, wait a second, this is not okay what's happening here.
Remember, it's an army, not a police force.
Right. Well, that's the thing. It's like they don't know how to deal with this sort of stuff. And during the early parts of the Intifada, so there was a kind of a cohort of young leaders that started to emerge from within Gaza and the West Bank, who were essentially calling for a civil rebellion, aimed to arrive at a dialogue with Israel over a solution based on a compromise between, Israelis and Palestinians. And so originally the idea was to use predominantly nonviolent means of protest, like civil disobedience, strikes, boycotts, and then also establishing autonomous institutions to replace the Israeli civil administration, courts and that kind of stuff. Also a drive to foster economic independence. People's committees, as they were called, were established to help those in need, bring supplies to refugee camps, care for the wounded, to conduct formal and informal education, create an alternative judicial system. One thing that I think really shocked a lot of Israelis at the time was Israeli Arabs or Palestinians living in Israel, depending on which terminology you want to use, kind of took up the cause. And that really threw a lot of Israelis for a loop, because I think in their mind, I think there was a sense among Jewish Israelis of like, hey, they've got it so good, what are they complaining about? But it's but there's a kind of a rising up of the Israeli Arab community in support of the Palestinian Intifada. There's a disagreement about kind of how the Intifada evolved. The Israeli version claims that in time, these people's committees were taken over by PLO representatives who advocated for the use of guns and increased violence against Israel, as well as violence against those deemed collaborators. The Palestinian perspective also acknowledges that at some point leadership was taken over by the PLO. However, they claim that the entirety of the Intifada was, quote, totally nonviolent, and that Palestinians, quote, used only stones in confrontation. And this is another one of those things, like I talked about at the beginning, where it's like, there's evidence that that's just not true. Like, and that's the thing, because there's so much, you know, in the book that I referenced, there is so much of it that is thoughtful and is, I think, really enlightening. And then there's these moments where you're like, dude, what are you doing? Like, you know, that's not true. But I digress yet again. So the Intifada, I mean, really in name, it lasted for, people say, anywhere from 4 to 6 years, really until Oslo. But the initial thrust of it kind of dies out by 91 for sure, and the Gulf War and all that. And so, like, what's the result of this? Like, what ended up kind of, what was gained or lost from this first Intifada? Maybe the biggest thing was that a real sense of solidarity and cohesion emerged among Palestinians. Both Palestinian and Israeli histories talk about that. This was one of the first times where you really had Palestinians of kind of all walks of life kind of working together towards a common goal. So, rich, poor, educated, uneducated, different, classes, different communities, different mindsets, whatever, everyone kind of started to coalesce in one direction. The trend towards a political resolution to the conflict, it kind of went public. So this idea that there could even be a political resolution actually kind of came out into the public discourse among Palestinians, whereas previously it had been basically like, we will take it by force. Jordan essentially like tapped out and was like, you know what, we're not involved in this anymore. You do your thing, Palestinians. Like, you are a legitimate people. You can take responsibility for yourselves. You are capable of sovereignty. So we are going to slowly back away so no one gets us involved in this. The Palestinian leadership that emerged at the beginning of the Intifada, kind of their influence was felt more, especially when it came to pushing Arafat and the PLO to come up with like a practical political plan for dealing with the conflict. It also hastened the Declaration of Independence for Palestine, which was put out in November of 1988, which included recognition of the UN Resolution 242, which I referenced early, and acknowledged the existence of 2 states for 2 peoples, which now, 35 years later, seems kind of like a shrug, but in that time, like, that was radical that was being put out there. So for the Israelis, they were totally taken aback by all of this. It's, again, I love my analogies, and they're usually terrible, but I like them anyways. It's like if 2 people are in a relationship and one person is giving every possible signal that they can that they're not happy with how the relationship is going, and the other partner is like just kind of oblivious to it. And then when, person A is like, okay, well, I'm breaking up with you. And they're like, what? I don't understand. What happened? We had a great thing going. Like, that's kind of what was happening here. Like, Israel seemed oblivious to what was going on. And now, you can question whether they were oblivious or whether they knew and just didn't really care. I think it's probably a little bit of both, to be honest. But so the complete surprise of the Intifada, like, kind of created some bewilderment within Israeli society. It damaged the sense of superiority that a lot of Israelis harbored toward the Palestinians. Kind of a lot of Israelis looked down on the Palestinians. And this, in a weird way, kind of shifted that. It increased the already existing rift between Jewish and Arab Israelis. It raised a lot of questions about combat ethics, as well as kind of the justice of Israel's position vis-a-vis the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And it exacerbated the political divisions in Israel already between left and right, especially over the question of territorial compromise, because, and really it's been the case since then, those, the Israeli political left, again, that's a really broad group, but has tended to be in favor of territorial compromise in exchange for peaceful relationships. The political right has tended to not want to do that. And so, we come out of the first Intifada into the 90s, and then, in 91, we get the Madrid conference, which kind of gets the ball rolling in these conversations about what could be between Israel and the Palestinians. We have the Gulf War, which because we have the fall of the Soviet Union, and so kind of America becomes the last standing superpower, and its influence in the world grows significantly. The Gulf War, because all of these Arab countries sided with the US against Iraq and Saddam Hussein, all of that kind of created an atmosphere where the Oslo Accords and an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians could take place. So it's already 7:53, so I don't want to keep anyone any longer than I already have. I appreciate your patience so much. I know I take a million tangents, and it's anyone who's ever studied with me in any place I've ever been learns that very quickly, that I love a tangent and I will follow it until someone slaps me and gets me back on track. So, but thank you all so much. Thank you guys on Zoom. We'll figure out a time to do round 4. It'll probably be after the first of the year. And when we do that, we'll start with Oslo and take ourselves to today. And I will tell you in advance, it's not a happy story. We're not going to have a lot of great feelings when we're all said and done. I wish that were not the case, but it's there's a lot of stuff to get through, and most of it is doesn't leave us feeling particularly good. So on that happy note, a very happy secular New Year to those of you who I won't see between now and then. And as always, if you have questions or anything, let me know. I will do my best to answer them. It sometimes takes me a couple days to get back to people on email, but I will get back to you at some point. Have no fear. Thank you all and have a great night.
Where are the recordings? Where can we find the recordings?
I believe they're on YouTube, on Temple High's YouTube page.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for coming.
Thanks for letting us get those questions.
Oh, yeah.